On this week's episode, we're joined by the web developer Kneight Reinagel, who talks about developing games for Board Game Arena. We discuss what happens if Board Game Arena shuts down. We talk about using Board Game Arena to gather statistics of gameplay for game development. We even talk about using Board Game Arena for marketing and to be used on Kickstarter. Finally, we discuss power creep. Let's get into it.
Game begin.
Let's go.
Bring your pretty face to my ad.
Amazing.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another awesome episode of Crowdfunding Nerds. I am your host, Andrew Lowen, and I am joined as always by Sean and not Rick. In Rick's place, we have actually Kneight Reinagel, who is the Deliverance Board Game Arena developer, but he owns a company called Kogo Garage and is a full stack web developer. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah. So we were planning on we actually right before this podcast recording, we were meeting about Deliverance Board Game Arena stuff, and the topic for our episode is power creep, and also something that I did over the weekend, which was a Deliverance raid event. We wanted to kind of talk about that, just events for your fans and whatnot, and how one medium that I used and it was very successful, and so I thought I would share that. But before we get into all that, let's talk about you first, and just so share a little bit about yourself for our listeners and your expertise, and then we'll dive in.
So, my official expertise would be problem solving in general. My wife absolutely loves it, and I've used it to good effect in pretty much all programming skills. I've taught myself programming back in high school and went on to do specifically game programming for college. Then afterwards, I didn't find any games I wanted to work on because I always felt like I'm being called to do games that glorify God but appeal to a secular audience.
Mm-hmm.
And those you just can't find in AAA studios ever, anywhere.
Yeah.
So to pay the bills, I got a job in web development, which I then programmed for like 10, 12 years. Very complex, the Magento platform,
Mm-hmm.
which is, if you're unfamiliar, if you want to have a Amazon.com personalized to your own brand and company, Magento will do that for you. And so after a long time of that, I kind of felt the call to start spending my off time in hobbying, and start doing my own personal game development once more. I thought I'll get my feet wet in Board Game Arena, because they do the full tech stack that I've already been doing: JavaScript, CSS, HTML, PHP, MySQL. So it seemed like a natural fit. And then I saw Andrew with his Deliverance game.
Yeah.
And of course, well, that seems to appeal to secular audiences with a rating of 8+ on BGG, as well as definitely glorifying God, not being ashamed of the Christian theme. And so I said, well, God, if this is what you've got for me, let's see what happens. And so I contacted Andrew. He contacted God.
Yeah.
And
I have a
here
direct
we are.
cell phone connection. Just phoned him up. I was like, hey, what do you think about this? Yeah, it was interesting because originally, actually, a little bit of behind the curtain, I asked for estimates on Board Game Arena, and I received two different estimates. One was from you, and another was from a French company. The French company said it would be like $15,000 to do the BGA mod, and you said it'd be $40,000. And I was like, wow, that's expensive. Like, both of them are expensive, but like, do I want to spend, and at the time, like, we had enough money in the bank from selling our games to do it. But when the money is spent, it is no longer in the bank. And I remember way back in the day, my parents, when they were like, hey, I said I wanted to buy a PlayStation 2, and they were like, yeah, well, you can, but or it was a PS3, I think, and my mom said, like, I remember I would always buy stuff, and she was giving me a lesson. I would always buy stuff as when I was younger, and I would go through tight, hard financial times, and I would always look at my stuff and say I would rather have the money instead. And I thought about it, and I ended up buying the PS3. It ended up serving so well for many, many years as not only a gaming system, but a DVD player. And it was like our DVD player until it finally died. And I just, it kind of, but the lesson really stuck with me. It's like, should I buy things? Or would I rather have the money? And so it's one of the things I always think about. And I thought, well, when the money is gone, it's very hard to earn again. And 40K is just, too much for me. And 15K seems like if I did that, it wouldn't be the right version of the game. And so I thought in my head, no, I'm not going to do this yet. I'll do it later. And then you kind of reached back and you were like kind of in this weird situation where your company wasn't able to pay you because they had money embezzled or something like that. And you were like, hey man, I'm willing to do this for less than my normal hourly rate. And for me, I had a choice. I was like, well, here's another opportunity. I can kind of like, in a way, me being in the position I was in, I could kind of take advantage of the situation and say, yeah, I'll get the product for less. But the way that I find working with contractors in a service based business, you're paying for their time. You're also paying for their attention, and you're paying for their best work. But and so what I find is like, I could have taken advantage of you in the situation that you were in because you really kind of needed the money, you needed the cash flow and that kind of thing. Otherwise, you'd be dipping in your savings and whatnot. And I never behave that way. I've learned you have to pay people what they ask, because if you don't pay them what they ask, then they're going to feel like they are undervalued, and that's going to reflect in their work. They're not going to be as passionate about that for you as though they, or as if they they were able to, if they felt like you've actually valued them, then they would put full effort and attention in. And so we talked about it, and I kind of, you offered me a number, and I came back and was like, hey, let's do like, 5K a month. That's what I'm paying. And you said, okay, here's my hourly rate, and I'll work because Deliverance is a big project. It's like, I can do like 5K a month. We'll see how many months it takes to get us like the minimum viable product for Board Game Arena. And you said, okay, here's my hourly rate. And then you kind of gave back to me, instead of saying like, once we reach your billable hourlies, that's it. Instead, what you said was, if I have extra time, I'll work more. And then it'll just be like a cap at 5K. And sometimes, dude, you put in like 100 extra hours in a month. It's like, is that accurate? That's not too far off, is it?
I'm going to pull up the doc and check,
Yeah.
because I know it's been, so I put in 60 plus
Yeah.
extra hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's pretty
Like
good.
200 plus hours a month sometimes.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for putting all that extra time in. And the Deliverance may very well be the most complicated game on BoardGameArena.com. Is that an accurate assessment?
With the qualifier, maybe, yes. Because they've got a ton of games on there. I don't know all of them, but it's definitely up there, and it will definitely be the most complicated one that is a campaign.
Yeah. It's interesting, just turning, but it was so funny because, when you turn a board game into, in essence, Board Game Arena is a video game platform. It's just a way to fully program every single card. In case you don't know, boardgamearena.com is kind of like, for those that are listening, Tabletop Simulator. But instead of purchasing through Steam and having each board game developer create their own mod within Tabletop Simulator for their board game, Board Game Arena is a website that you can actually develop a board game. So every single card has to be programmed in, rather than the card just the shape of the card being programmed in. In Tabletop Simulator, you basically coat the front of the card with the art and the back of the card with the whatever the text is on the card. And the players themselves will read the card and interpret what happens. But on Board Game Arena, the computer does all of that for you. So when something says deal 2 damage to target angel or whatever, that has to automatically happen. So you see, which target, and it has to auto select, and you see the damage happening, or you need some sort of indicator programmed in to see the damage happening.
Can we put sound effects in?
Oh yeah, we should.
Yes,
we
like
should.
when an angel gets damaged, like or like this quake sound effects, or the Doom ones.
So Board Game Arena has some default swishes and swipes that they have whenever cards are drawn or tokens are given.
Okay.
But I have thought about what would a spiritual sword hitting spiritual flesh sound like to mortal ears.
It's like
sound like schling and whatever. I could make the sound effects. I'll get you a file with my voice making sound effects. Also, I'd really like the Street Fighter 2 when somebody's defeated, the old Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Like,
oh yeah, that one.
When
yeah, the Mortal Kombat one. Finisher.
Also, maybe like the Final Fantasy VII victory, like battle victory.
Or we need an announcer. That's what we. So I'm getting carried away. We need an announcer. It's like quad damage, or monster kill. If you kill so many demons,
there is definitely a question on data limits, because I know our images directory, they recommend keeping things under 10 megabytes and keeping things compressed enough. There are so many art assets in Deliverance, like a ridiculous amount. And so in my private alpha, it was absolutely gorgeous, with the printed quality art assets that Andrew was giving. But of course, that was like 200 megabytes. And so getting them compressed down to all of that stuff and still being somewhat legible for people, because you're reading text on a card with your pixels, and JPEGs are famous for spreading that text out and making it blurry.
Yeah. Yep.
So getting that right balance, and right now we are at right around the 15 meg mark.
Yeah, it's and we've been talking about ways to make it more efficient, like, basically stripping the text off all of the art. So instead of 150 talents, we only need 1 talent to, which is like the card front. And then the text areas are 2. Okay, 2.
1 for angels, 1 for demons.
Yeah, that's right. And so we just need those 2 art pieces, and that saves almost 200 small cards in that are currently programmed in. And so we could save like a megabyte of space there. And so part of it is efficiency. Board Game Arena requires us to work within certain constraints, but in the end, we have a game that you can play solo. You can play with up to 4 players. You programmed in 5 angels. And the whole reason that I wanted to do this, number one, is to be able to demonstrate a product in as many ways as possible. So if people are actually playing the game, or so that a lot of people use Board Game Arena. A lot of people love Board Game Arena, and the way that I look at it is, if you like Ticket to Ride developed an app, and so you can play Ticket to Ride for free, or maybe there's like a premium version you can purchase or something. But when people have an experience with the game and they learn the rules in a really easy way through a digital medium, the research has shown, and this has been a long time since I've looked at this, but more Ticket to Rides were sold afterward. And it had an effect on people that finally got to experience the game. More people ended up purchasing. I've seen some conflicting reports that it seems that what some people would say that digital, making something digital doesn't increase the sales that you get, or it doesn't majorly increase. But I actually would say I believe opposite, because of just, from anecdotal evidence, when you give people a demonstration of your product that they enjoy, the they will want to buy. And so I'm thinking that if we put our product on Board Game Arena,
It's a giant
that's going
ad.
to be a way to demonstrate, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big
Yeah.
advertisement.
Yeah. And if you
And
love the
also,
game, you'll want it in person.
Hmm.
yeah, you need to buy it in person if you want to play with house rules.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the big thing.
I'm just gonna go back in time.
Like it's
gonna redo that
it's too
decision.
punishing as written.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
So
actually one thing that people ask for is an undo button, because they press a button. They're like, oh no, I figured out a better thing. But Board Game Arena actually discourages an undo button. Is
yeah,
that
get
right?
good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
Nate,
Yeah, it's like
I have a
you need to
question
think
about
through.
the development, because I know,
Mhm.
Andrew, you've talked about the investment of getting this up, and it's quite costly. I'm sure there's lots of people listening and they're thinking, well, I'm a way off from being able to invest that much into something. And some people might be at a position where they can invest that much. My concern would be the platform Board Game Arena itself. Is the project open source? Because if that website or company shuts down, are you going to lose all your work? Are you going to lose that investment? Or are you able to port everything you've done to a different system? Is there a way to kind of use what you've done and bring it somewhere else?
So I believe we actually could if we really wanted to, um, because most of those game files, they're our game is technically a mod that is run on their website that we're updating the files and everything, but then they give us a bunch of, if not all of the core code, um, to stub things out and make our IDEs happy.
Mhm. So in
And then
theory,
I'm
we
sure
could
there's some other
develop our own website if we needed to.
yeah, I'm sure there's some other proprietary business and stuff out there. But
Mhm.
also, a big part of this development has been um, because Board Game Arena, they give you a framework in which to connect with other players and create a table. That's something that we would have to recreate for an app. Um, and then a framework of just generic art asset size tabletop simulator style, the physical cards and tiles and tokens and stuff of your board game
Yep.
that they have. And that's pretty much what they give, a nice framework for moving that kind of stuff around. But then on top of that, we've had to build an entire new framework and an entire new, um, essentially, it's a Deliverance programming language
Yeah.
so that we can program the card. So when it says deal angel 2 damage, it'll look and see what are all the other states that are in play. Because there's darkness cards that will reduce that amount of damage dealt to demons. You can have empower, you can get bonus damage from various things. And it takes all of these various factors um, into accord when it's
Mhm.
actually striking with that deal damage.
Yeah. So, but to Sean's question, what you had mentioned to me before. So, Deliverance is a rather complicated engine. One of the more complicated games out there, really. I mean, it's you've got games that are on another level like Gloomhaven, and it's 160 possible scenarios, which is just a raw, like a lot of things to program, right? A lot of time required. And so you'd have to build out a system that could kind of handle all of the possible inputs. But most games aren't so complicated, right?
No,
Um,
no, they're not.
so like,
Like
what's an example of a game that you could build quickly?
another 90 plus dollar game that I played on Board Game Arena and in real life is Terra Mystica. Um, and that's one that it's got some amount of complications to it. Um, but it's actually, I think everything is going to be pretty basic compared to Deliverance. Because the only differences in there is each race has a preferred terrain type. The terrains always change the same. The round bonuses, it can be a random one of a dozen. Um, and some of those are repeats. So that's not an issue for
Mhm.
drawing or making it rough. And then each of the races, there's, I believe, 14 in that game. They're all pretty much the same basic mechanics, with a slight variation depending on the race.
Mhm.
And so it's like that's a game that would take, I don't know, a month or two to put out.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then it'll all be UX updates.
hmm Yeah. And now we're currently in Deliverance Alpha. We're actually, we may be in beta within a week or something, but this is which is open for players to just to enjoy and play. Um, and that process took us. This is our 9th month, right?
Yeah.
So it's been a significant amount of time that we've invested into this. And yeah, I'm so far I'm really really happy because the game itself looks awesome. I'm going to be able to get people to play. We can actually track statistics and figure out how many people are beating the game at what difficulty level, what and other things like that. We can
What's the
even
most
give
played
achievements.
angel? Is that
Uh-huh.
information there?
Yeah,
Great. Yes, that's all
yeah,
super valuable information in terms of marketing moving forward.
right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very, very interesting for an actual, just people trying the game and how many people, replay. We've got people that are putting in like 40, 50 games. Like it's just a crazy amount of games. Some people, I always see them on Board Game Arena in a game. So it's pretty
So what's
cool.
the generally for your community? I know it's still an alpha, not everyone has had access to it, but what's been the general consensus? Has it been relatively positive? Has there been some criticisms? Whereabouts are people sort of resting?
Overall, people are very excited. They're generally contributing and saying, like filling out bug reports, and they like one of the things we didn't originally plan for beta or for our earliest release was solo mode. We thought, well, we'll focus on 2, 3, 4 angels, and that way, we'll do solo later. And that was the number one most requested thing that was requested enough times. It was like, yeah, we got to change this and give these people what they want quickly. And so Kneight actually pivoted, and when we figured that out and put solo out like a week or two later, which was pretty cool. But it's been received very positively. People are playing the game that don't own it, that are like looking at it for the next Kickstarter to decide if they want it or not. We actually also made it free, so there's nothing you have to download, nothing that you have to like Tabletop Simulator. There are barriers to entry where you have to learn.
Mm.
You have to learn to use Tabletop Simulator, which means you have to relearn how to use your hands. If you're not familiar with the style of like moving, the camera with WASD and like looking with your mouse, like if that's not familiar to you, which is super second nature as a like an MMO player or an RTS or MOBA or
That's
whatever
noob movement keys,
FPS
man.
player.
It's
Yeah.
AS, it's ASDF. That's how you move.
Yeah. No, it's I have yeah. So
Or
anyway,
ESDF.
yeah, ASDX is what some people use, but I'm just a scrub. So, um, but yeah, so I think that the general idea is I feel that a lot of people have played. It's in alphas, which means that we have to invite people specifically. They cannot see and play the game right now unless they are invited to the Deliverance players group, which has to be done by Kneight or myself. And after it really enters beta, then people will be able to see it that I don't necessarily know. So if I send out a call for, hey, Board Game Arena is available, a stranger that might be lurking on Board Game Geek or Facebook or whatever may actually fire it up and give it a try, decide they really like it, and then become a fan. So it just feels like a very low barrier to entry. It is something that I can really kind of champion, and it almost becomes like what I would call it. I would put it at the top of our funnel. It'd be one of the first things that I would want to tell people to do. So it's it's on the same level as here's the rule book.
Mm-hmm.
People want to look at the rule book and see if the game is complicated or if it's interesting or if the rule book's good or bad. Um, they also would want to see Board Game Arena on that same level. So I think that if you can do it, it's really valuable. But I don't think that it's necessarily worthwhile to do before you're, as a company before you're ready for it, if that makes sense. And I can qualify that later.
And Andrew, is it going to be available for the coming expansion? Will you be able to put it on the Kickstarter page and say, "Hey, check it out here"?
Yes, that's kind of one of the major things we're trying to do is get to beta before we launch the expansion, so that people can actually play and give it a go. They'll only be able to play the classic game rather than like all the expansion characters, but it's
Enough to
going
get
to
them in.
be right. Yeah, so we'll be able to get them in over time. And as we have these first 5 angels we've decided to include, we can pivot. Instead of adding our 6th base game angel, we can start adding expansion angels if we wanted. So it's definitely something that the I guess I would probably settle with polling our audience and saying like, hey, would you like to play these characters? And maybe what we would do is make those characters premium or something. Like, Board Game Arena has a premium and which is like their membership, the equivalent of their membership. It's basically like $2-3 a month that you can pay in order to be able to run premium games. They're the higher quality games like Terraforming Mars and Arc Nova and things like that. But you don't have to be a premium member to just play games. So if you just queue up, you basically sit in a queue for a spot to open. So all somebody else needs to do is be a premium member, start a game, and then you can join, whenever. So it's a pretty cool system. And I will also say that the user base is massive compared to Tabletop Simulator. Nate, do you have any idea of the user base size in Board Game Arena?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. I wanted to say that it's like at least 10 times the size of Tabletop Simulator's user base. It's like very like the group sizes and everything are really large. So I wonder I think I saw stats on their actual website. So if I can find those later, I'll say something about it.
So, Andrew, do you know how
I
many
can
people
find
who
some
have currently
stats.
played the alpha?
Yeah, I can figure that out. I can figure out how many people have played, right? How many games have been played. Not exactly sure how. So we have 548 members. I want to say we've had
So,
over
but we've
600 games.
had total games played is 677.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's
Okay.
not bad for just an alpha.
Yeah.
In what, a month or less,
Yeah.
something like that.
Well, that's
And
exactly.
at
It's not even
least,
out yet.
Yeah.
yeah. And 3 players have played 50 games each, at least.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are some people that really, really love this. And what I like about that is that I give my most hardcore fans, I kind of get to stay in front of them and they will champion the game and comment about the game whenever they have an opportunity. And if it's just kind of, in front of them all the time, it's the game they'll always be talking about. Right. So I think it's a really powerful kind of a marketing thing. And I'll say that, it was expensive, but we were ready. So what I decided originally was with the very first Kickstarter of Deliverance, we made 314K. We had to make the game and we had to deliver it. And then with the remaining stock, so we made 5,000 units of the game and about between 2,000 to 2,500 of each add-on. And we sold through most of the add-ons and about 2,700 units of the game before we actually, buy the, through the Kickstarter or the pre-sale, after the Kickstarter. And so what I decided was that normally what you would do as a as a board game publisher is you would reprint the game using the revenue from whatever stock you had left over. So I'm selling, if I sell 2,000 units, that's about $100 a game. So, whatever that is, $200,000. That money needs to be it needs to be enough to actually print the game again. So if we can't reprint the game, then you have, once you sell out of your units, in theory, based on the not having enough money in the bank account to do another print run, you're done. But with the miracle of crowdfunding and Kickstarter and GameFound, is that you can print your second edition and fund it through crowdfunding. And so that's what we decided to do. So the money that we would have normally used for a second print run, we decided to instead put into an expansion and other various elements of the game, so like Board Game Arena, so that we can have more going on, and then we'll fund the second printing with an expansion. Now, I believe that you can't necessarily do that 10 times. Yeah, you can definitely do it twice. If people really love the first edition, they'll be much more likely to buy the second edition. But I think that at a certain point, you definitely are going to need to become self-sufficient as far as your ability to reprint. You don't necessarily need to reprint 10,000 units at a time or whatever, or like Jamie Stegmaier's 100,000 units of Wormspan. But 2 to 3,000 units in a print run, or 5,000, or that kind of thing. That's much more in line with what people do. Sometimes they just print 1,000, and it's not really. I think if you're printing 1,000 units again, like as a reprint, it's not really enough to sustain you as a company. I was talking to a buddy who used to work at USAopoly, was actually at the USAopoly headquarters, and they said they don't even print unless it's at least 5,000 units, because of the economies of scale. You get much better pricing, and you're actually able to kind of sustain the margins that you need as a board game publisher in order to kind of survive and make your own reprints and whatnot, and pay people to do what they do, graphic designers to design, and artists to art, and marketers to or to market. So
Andrew, one thing that is quite common in the sort of tabletop space is not only playing games, but collecting them. And now that you're talking about a second print of Deliverance, I'm wondering, are you going to make a slight graphical change, maybe put a little insignia somewhere, or a little icon, or a little bit of text saying second edition, so that people over time, they could even use this as some type of collector's item, where it's like, oh, I've got the first edition, or I've got the second edition. I know this is a huge part of kind of flipping games. So you'd buy 2 copies, one to use and play, and then one to keep in the sort of the wrapping, that you could sell at a later date, because if it's out of print, or that the first edition, there's not going to be another first edition, then you have this thing which you can then sell on later on if the game gets big enough. Is that something that you're thinking about in terms of kind of moving Deliverance forward with all these reprints?
not totally. However, so like the base game, one of the things I want is I want it to match what else exists out in the world, and also with our expansion, I want to make sure that players know. We might actually differentiate, kind of like Magic or other collectible card games do. We might put an icon on cards that let people know, hey, these cards were in the expansion. The icon missing is going to let people know that, oh, this was the base game. And they'll be able to differentiate between them if they ever want to separate them out for whatever reason.
A
But that's
massive typo.
yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. We
The
have a
massive
card.
typo Angela's is going to
Yeah,
become famous.
yeah. That one will be worth something. So like all the first edition, we have like, I want to say, 2 major misprints. One is our discrimination against people named Angela. Instead of angels, it was Angela's, and we had one of our characters had a misprint on it with telling it that, basically making it move a lot further than
The
and
Hateful
faster than it
Fiend,
should.
wasn't it?
Yeah. So, but in general, board games, good board games generally hold their value. It also depends on how many are made. So, publisher wise, if I were to make Deliverance, let's just say I made 10,000 copies of Deliverance instead of 5,000, would mean that at current stock levels, I've sold out. I think I have like 10 units of the game in various warehouses throughout the world, that we can send to reviewers or to people, or use for, part replacements. But in general, let's just say I made twice as many. That means I have 5,000 units left, and I have to figure out how to sell them now, because I only sold 5,000. I mean, reality is I would have run Facebook ads and done other things to sell them, and maybe more events and other things like that. So there are a lot of different factors, but I'm just, coming up with this weird situation of me having 5,000 units of my game left. They would definitely not keep their value, because if I need to sell, if my game's value is $99, I have, if I have 5,000 games left, I have basically $500,000 worth of inventory just sitting in a warehouse somewhere, and I need to sell that. So if I made, $300,000 instead, that would be like, that's money. I'm turning it into money versus it just sitting there and being cardboard. So the temptation is to offload that stock to anyone that will take it. Distributors will take it at 60% off retail. You'll have deep discounters that want to buy it and want to list it and whatnot, and they're going to go to Amazon and say, well, they only had to pay $50, or they had to pay whatever it was, $40 for the game, because their distributor, they sell it to a retailer that buys it at 50, who's just an online deep discounter, and they sell it on Amazon for $65. That devalues the product. And we've actually had experiences where, other companies have done that and have really lost control of their ability to sell that product, because deep discounters are just buying it for retail prices and reselling it for something that's far below what even the company itself could actually sell it for. I mean, if I were to sell Deliverance for $60, it's definitely not enough to reprint the game, in that cycle. But it's something that, you know, would cause the value to really drop. So like printing too many units is a problem. Now that said, oftentimes you'll have companies that will not print enough. And that's when the secondary market goes crazy. So companies like, that make big, chonky, miniature, heavy games that are well known, like Awaken Realms or Simon or, whatever. They have these big all-in pledge, or Chip Theory games. Like they have these big all-in pledges that are super premium that cost like $300 or $400. But after Kickstarter, you'll have these scalpers that bought extra copies specifically to sell them at double, right? And people buy them. If you want all the things, there are people that will pay a premium to have everything. And there are websites like the Game Steward is a great example, thegamesteward.com. If you miss a Kickstarter and you really want the Kickstarter edition of a product, you can buy it from the Game Steward, and they make their money by selling those awesome exclusive pledge levels at a premium, which I actually, as a retailer, well, as a publisher, I like that, because then there's added value for when people go to my site and buy it. They look elsewhere and they see, okay, this is a premium value. There's a premium value on this product. It looks really good for a publisher. So when you're selling at your MSRP, then people generally appreciate that. But it doesn't stop those other people from selling at a premium, because they have their audience, and they do marketing and other things too. So
I do know if you ever get yourself in a bind, because I saw a YouTube video recently of an online retailer who sat on a bunch of stock and couldn't get rid of it, and he just needed to get rid of it as soon as possible. But he donated it all to a 501c3 charity, and then you can write it off as a tax expense. so you just give it away for free, and at least you can write it off as a tax expense and kind of reduce your tax bill at the end of the year. So
yes,
that's what he was able to do. So if nothing else, you can donate it to a charity and write it off.
that's true. That really helps when you're making money, when you're selling stuff. If you have a big Kickstarter that you're trying to offset the income from the Kickstarter, because if you live in the United States, the IRS doesn't care that it was an investment from hundreds or thousands of people. They think it's income. And so if you make, like I did, $300,000 in tax year 2021, and you still have to pay $150,000 manufacturing bill and whatever $80,000 or $90,000 in shipping and whatnot, the IRS doesn't care. They're like, hey, you owe money on, you owe taxes on $300,000, and so you have to, so oftentimes, there's an accounting method called accrual basis accounting, and which is what you definitely want to do to kind of protect that. But yeah, it is definitely a way to reduce your overall liability. A lot of bigger companies like Stronghold Games will do things like that when they have when they make a lot of products and they have, let's say, 15 games sitting in their warehouse at various quantities of 500 or less, and they're just kind of the Kickstarter's over, the new hotness is something else that they're marketing, and so they're not necessarily looking to push old product. They can actually sell or give those to charities and reduce their tax liability. I think that's smart.
So changing gears, but still within the same vein of what we've been talking about, let's discuss power creep. This is something that I've been thinking about, and it kind of ties in with this idea of collector's editions that we've spoken about. And power creep is something that you usually find within trading card games because there's a limited run of a certain series of cards, and then they don't print those ever again. And the reason is because the next series is going to be more powerful. So people who want to stay competitively have to buy the more powerful set. So eventually these older cards get flushed out of the system, and people move always constantly towards the most powerful or the newest cards, so to speak. And then the older items, especially if they're unopened, become collectibles because they are out of print. They can become extremely rare, and then people like to collect and then sell them and things. And so that's part of the kind of collecting element within power creep. But I think in terms of power creep, it impacts on two levels. I think a lot of people don't recognize this, is that it can happen mechanically with your game, your enemies just become stronger, the actual gameplay, but it can also happen thematically. And I think this is something that's often overlooked. So, and Andrew, both of us, we played a lot of World of Warcraft back in the day. But if you remember, like the very first World of Warcraft, I think the final boss was Kulthazad, I think. And I think in the lore, Kulthazad is a warlock who's underneath Arthas, so he's controlled by Arthas, who's the Lich King. So you defeat this kind of lieutenant of the big baddie. But then the next expansion, you're defeating Illidan, and he's like this huge. He's like controls this whole place called the Outland. And then the next expansion, well, then you actually kill Arthas, this king of this Lich King. So like, and then the next one's like this big cataclysm. So like, it keeps on like thematically. It starts off quite small. Like the first thing you do when you play is like, oh, go gather some berries or something. And at the end of the game, you're destroying these like massive warlocks. But then that keeps on happening where, you're 20 years in and now everything is over the top. Everyone is basically walking around with this massive armor with like lightning, and everyone just looks so powerful. And when everyone's powerful, well, no one's powerful. No one feels special. And then it all kind of just gets melded into this big giant pot of kind of weirdness. So power creep happens mechanically, but also happens thematically. I think that's something that you kind of have to keep an eye on because I think it's been detrimental to the games like the Pokemon trading card game. Pokemon was pocket monsters, and the idea was that little kids were going around in their backyards finding Pokemon, capturing them, and then like battling with them. But this power creep has happened there, where now in the competitive game is about who can basically summon like these Pokemon that essentially
max
they essentially govern the elements of the world. So it's like I'm summoning lightning itself and I'm fighting you, and it's more like poker gods. It's almost like Yu-Gi-Oh at this point, where people are summoning these ancient gods and they're fighting. So it's thematically changed over time, which has been quite interesting. But I don't like that. I like the idea of being a little kid and catching little bugs rather than summoning the forces of nature itself.
Yeah, I do think that power creep is a problem for a couple of reasons. Number one, sometimes games that have power creep in them, they didn't think that it would make it this far. If you look at like in a TV series, one of the most famous TV series that has the same problem in its own format is Lost, where Lost knew where it was going for the first 4 seasons, and then on season 5 they were like, we never thought we'd make it this far, and all of the big fans of Lost really kind of hate what they did, and it wasn't because what they did was necessarily bad. It was just that they kind of painted themselves into a corner and were like, well, now we have to deal with all of these contradictions that we kind of set the stage for. How are we going to do that? And so you have these big moments of reset. So like in World of Warcraft, when you have like 3,000 was like a massive number to deal 3,000 critical damage to somebody in like the classic version of World of Warcraft. Well, then the expansion came out, added 10 levels, added new items, but you couldn't just scale in a linear fashion with you had 10 agility on an armor piece, and now the new ones have whatever 10% more, so like 11. You had to double the agility on something so that it would actually matter, right? And so you instead of getting instead of going from 3,000 as a massive number to like 3,500 or whatever, it's more like 10,000 is a massive number. And so when you go from the next expansion, you had numbers that were 30,000, 40,000 critical hit, and that much damage just coming out. And then the following expansion, you had like, it was like they changed the numbers. Instead of just being these massive numbers that scroll entirely across the screen, they change it to like 10K or whatever, right? And not what they did, where they started to be like 1M for a million and whatever, right? And then finally they hit a big reset button where they're like, everybody, we just can't, scale this any further. It was like, what is 10L? What is like all these Roman numerals? Like, what does this mean? So what they did was they kind of hit the reset button on the levels and the stats and everything. So now they went kind of back to 10 agility as like the high or whatever, in this example. And so that's one option that you can do in a video game, but you can't really do that in a tabletop game. And there are other types of power creep that don't even require expansions that are present in tabletop games. Video games oftentimes, when something is too powerful, you just patch it so that you hit it with the Nerf bat, and now instead of that thing dealing 5,000 damage, it only deals 2 or whatever, and that's just a very easy change. But in a board game, you can no longer change it once you've actually printed it. And so, Deliverance coming back with the expansion, there are some things that we've done with the intent to kind of modify previous cards that have come out, but yeah, there are interesting challenges. So I think the first solution, I guess, to kind of getting in front of power creep, because power creep is a problem that makes older content feel totally obsolete. It's like, why did I buy all of this when the new stuff is the only thing that I'm going to use? So that's kind of the problem that I see with it. And so to get ahead of that, you really need to, number one, have a plan for how are you going to continue to scale the amount of content in the game without necessarily scaling the power level of the game. And I think that that's one really important thing. If you have a plan for that, that's good. So one example in Deliverance is like, you have certain angels in the base game. I can just make more angels, and there's a greater variety of content. As long as those new angels aren't clearly and markedly more powerful than the old ones, that's a really important thing. And like, to go very granular and give one very specific example, we have an angel called Azrael, the angel of death. He scales, he kind of deals damage based on what are called afflictions. It's like negative status effects to on demons. Well, when I add new status effects into the game, Azrael gets more benefits because he can put, any status effect he wants on something. And so he's, by, every expansion, he's going to get a little stronger because there are new status effects that he can use that weren't available before. So that's one way. Another is, we have what we call the 50 damage or the 50 turn test. It's like, how much damage can a single character deal given all the, basic starting things in 50 turns? Just with their character, you can throw more random things, like, what if they draw a particular card or get a particular combination? And that's we actually don't factor that in, but we factor in their basic abilities. And what we found is that for a single target damage, Michael the Archangel is the highest damage dealing character to a single target right from the very get-go. And over 50 turns, he's going to deal 360 damage given all of our Deliverance stats. That means that he's going to deal an average of, I think it's like 7.12 damage per turn. And that's like the highest, consistent damage. So when we do this 50 turn test on new characters, that's like kind of our benchmark. So if something has more utility than him and deals more average damage per turn than him, that's power creep. We are now scaling the game. We have a character that's clearly more powerful than our top of the line dude. So, and Michael has some big drawbacks. Like he's not very good at healing. He's not very good at support. He just likes to punch things. And so, I had this one character that we were developing that was kind of like a bard, where it had for just using common speak, like auras that affected your allies and benefited them somehow and whatnot. Well, he dealt an average, or she, it's a female character, she dealt an average damage of like 8 per turn and had all of this crazy utility. And so it's like, if I release this character in this current form, it's just going to break the game. Like, play that character if you want to win, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or all the content has to now be scaled with that character in mind. So, you've got to make everything hit harder, make everything have more health, to compensate. So instead of an average demon health of like 8 or 9, you have to have an average demon health of like 10 or 11 to be able to, kind of deal with characters like that, which makes all the old characters weak. So things like that, like are tools that we use to just try to avoid power creep. And there are other considerations too, but I'd like to get your guys' thoughts.
So I think just looking at the term power creep, let's focus first on the creep, because it's something that people do subconsciously most of the time. That's how it creeps up always. Thematically, like you said, you see these people, it's like first you're saving your village, then you're saving your city, then you're saving your region, then you're saving your country, then you're saving the world, then you're saving the multiverse. Um, it's like that's just how it scales. And it's always people looking for the next thing. And I think that part of that, it's greatly addressed by just being conscious of it as a subconscious thing, and actively fighting against it will help keep it down. And the other part of it is it's power creep. This most effectively hits things that are a power fantasy, the Final Fantasy games or superhero type things, where everybody wants to feel a little special. They're more powerful than all these other things around. You just swipe your blade, and it's like Sauron with his mace hitting 10 people back at a time. Bam, bam. But Deliverance, it does have some of that power fantasy to it, because you're playing as an angel, much more powerful than us mortals. However, they are bound within limits, and it is at core a strategy game. And so that strategize, tactical puzzle solving of, with my limited powers, how do I accomplish this mission?
Mm-hmm.
And so that right there helps out a lot. And is a great benefit to just the board game in general.
Yep.
So we've been talking about power creep in terms of something negative, and this is how you avoid, or this is how you design to avoid power creep from it impacting your games. But some people design with power creep in mind. It's like, I want my things to get more powerful. I want the older stuff to become obsolete, so people are incentivized to buy the newer stuff. So maybe we want to talk a little bit about that, and maybe about the ethics about it. I don't know if that's a great business model. It's like, I'm intentionally going to make the older stuff bad so that people are more incentivized to buy the newer stuff.
That right there is when it's the power fantasy. Like, I need to be more powerful, the most powerful. But at its core, while you're doing some amazing things inside the lore of Deliverance, at its core, it is a tactical puzzle solving, kind of game. And so it's like the power creep shouldn't be put in there, I would argue. I think that Andrew's doing it the right way, with just being cognizant of these certain things. Now, of course, there's going to be some cards that are just much more powerful, like, oh, I want to draw that prayer card. It's like, I want the Black Lotus.
Yeah.
And things can definitely scale in the opposite way, like, the Power 9.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, to use the same example of Azrael that I used before, he had a particular skill called the Final Plague, which is, calling back to the final plague, the 10 plagues of Egypt. And so this Final Plague, what it does is it deals an amount of damage equal to one stat and repeats it a number of times equal to another stat. So, adding one strength and one discipline, which are stats in the game, if you have 2 strength and 2 discipline, you're now, instead of dealing 2 damage on 2, twice, you're dealing 3 damage 3 times, which is not, I mean, 2 damage twice is 4, 3 damage 3 times is 9. But when you're dealing 7 damage 7 times, that's 49. 8 damage 8 times is 64. I mean, it starts to really, like, that's a 15 damage spread versus a 5 damage spread just by upping your stats by 1. So I know there are going to be opportunities for increases and for these scaling things. And so I think I have, in that one ability, I have 2 different effects that scale. So if somehow you can make one stat high, then it's going to deal a lot of damage or repeat a lot of times. If you can make the other stat high, then you now have this exponential, well, it's, I guess, like, it's an exponential curve of power. And so exponential curves are where some of the most classic power creep happens. We did this, like, highest damage challenge in our Discord to see how many people could deal the highest damage with each character, and every character would generally deal between 70 and like 85 damage, and Azrael did 176, with the ideal perfect conditions and whatnot. You could have any 5 cards of whatever that you want, and it just opened my eyes. I was like, yeah, that's a problem. So one of the, to, like, kind of talk about what you mentioned, Sean, it's not good to incentivize power creep in a board game, because oftentimes you'll take games that have been on your shelf for 10 years and play them. So you'll play the old version of the game, and you may have, like, I love Lord of the Rings, Journeys to Middle Earth. Like, I have a bunch of expansions for that. Other things that would that could cause power creep, but then I will still play the original game, the original campaign, and everything like that. And I think that you're not, as a board game publisher, you're not really incentivized to implement power creep into your stuff. Whereas when you make a collectible card game, you need to change things in a way that either makes it feel different, or, like, with Ascension, you'll have, like, now you have a pirate ship that's going around in a circle that is some sort of mechanic in one Ascension expansion, and then you've got just this, I don't know, the standard Ascension that you could play, or you could play the pirate ship version and it's different. But then there's this other, you want to incentivize people to buy the new set, not only because it has this new effect, or maybe because it has classic cards reprinted that are now better or more interesting. So that's maybe one style, but, like, collectible card games are straight up, like, you need to have cards. I remember, like, a 2/2 was a standard character for 2 mana, like 2/2 for 2 mana in Magic the Gathering. Now you need it's going to be much more powerful. You'll have, it's very standard to have a 3/3 for 1 mana or 3/3 for 2 mana attack defense, but the new cards are clearly more powerful than the old cards. The way that they ramp up is clearly more powerful than the old ones. And as you mentioned, the old ones become collectible, but the new ones are there because they want you to buy the new stuff. That's how they survive, is you buy the new sets. Whereas in board games, you kind of survive based on the popularity of a particular card game or game. So Terraforming Mars is a great example of this, where Terraforming Mars is the reason that Fricks Games, based out of Sweden, exists, and they make tons of products that supplement that. But the big one, the number one seller, is the base game. In any expansion, like when I like this Deliverance expansion, when let's just say we sell 2,000 Deliverance expansions on this Kickstarter, I hope we do. That'd be awesome. Then I, I reprint the base game. So what quantity of base games to expansion should I print? I will generally sell 4 times as many base games as I will expansions after release. So if I print 1,000 expansions, I should print 4,000 base games so that there can be a correct ratio, because there are so many more people that are going to discover the game, and they're going to say, oh yeah, what is this game? And they're not going to have any idea of Kickstarter or not. They're going to look at the expansion, which requires the base game to play, but they've never heard of this thing. So they need the base game first. So that's kind of the most important thing to consider as like a board game publisher. Which kind of brings me to one thing I'd love to kind of get in there before we come in for a landing, which is power creep within a single edition of your game. So like, you have other dungeon crawl type games like Too Many Bones is a really popular series. You have 3, they're called gear locks, like little characters that you can choose. And there are some that are more powerful than others. Generally the top 3 are Nugget, Gilly, and Tantrum. Like if you want to have an easier game, play those characters because they're fun, but they're very powerful and flexible, and they have a lot of utility, and or like Lord of the Rings, Journeys of Middle Earth. Like if you want to win that game, play Legolas with the Great Bow. It'll be a lot easier, There's this effect in the game called Cleave, which hits multiple targets. And so, if you deal 4 damage but you have a bunch of little goblins on the field, it's so much better if you can just cleave. You hit all the goblins in a particular pack, and it makes things a lot easier. He also has on his character the ability to move, which is a rare thing in Journeys of Middle Earth. It's a very valuable asset to be able to move one space, and that character is included in the base game. So if you want a more challenging experience, then don't play Legolas, right? And so I think that certain players find value in just winning. The game is more fun if they win. And I find that is true with a lot of Deliverance players. They like the game better if they win. They want to feel like, oh my goodness, we could lose, but then they would like the game is just more fun and more memorable if they win. So I don't know what your guys' thoughts are there.
Is that part of what inspired the difficulty level on the back of the angel boards?
Yes. Yes.
Difficulty like 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 4.
Yeah, so that's something that I wanted players to look at. The players that are looking at the characters because they're non-gamers and they're trying to find a character that's easy to play, they look for the 1 difficulty. And then the players that are looking for a challenge, kind of almost like a puzzle mini game, the ones that are like the alpha gamers, they're looking for the characters that have a difficulty of like 3 or 4. It's almost like 1 or 2 is not as attractive to them. And so it's just different player types,
As that difficulty level, I was looking at it as not necessarily the character's power for power creep type thing, but just how many rules you need to simultaneously keep in your head while playing them.
Yep.
Because like Miko's movement isn't like anybody else's movement. It's every time you do something, she moves, and you have to remember that every time you do something.
Yep.
Same thing like Talos a high difficulty, and he's got the deadened nerves. Every time he takes damage, you reduce it by 1, and you have to remember to do that yourself.
Yeah.
But I think you hit the nail on the head, Andrew, in terms of the power creep, comparing board games to trading card games, because they have different business models, as you said. In a board game, you are essentially buying the entirety of the game. It's a closed system. Whilst a trading card game, you're buying an element of the game. And in order to get the entire game, well, you got to get booster packs and trade and do these other things in order to get the kind of totality of everything that's available within that sort of set or season. So I think in terms of power creep, it's only really becomes relevant in the board game space with expansions, right? Because that's kind of like, oh, now I'm adding something to this kind of, I'm expanding the universe, so to speak. So that's really, and we've already discussed that. But I think in terms of users designing a game, the board game model is fine. You're not going to have to worry about power creep, but it's really going to impact the board game designer and your marketing choices when you think about expansions and expanding your content, expanding your universe, both thematically and also mechanically. I know we've talked a lot about the mechanics of power creep, but what are your thoughts on the thematic side of it, Andrew? Because I do know you've got things in the future. You don't have to reveal them, but I imagine they do become more and more deadly. I suppose the foes probably become bigger and bigger and bigger. Is that something that you're also thinking about? Where, how do I manage power creep mechanically, but also thematically?
Yeah. So like you mentioned how in Pokemon, you've got like the TCG, you've got these characters which are essentially the raw element of lightning and versus Pikachu. Just like this cute little like rat that is like a lightning rat with pink cheeks. So I do think that eventually will be, so like one of the ways that we avoid this is we avoided monstrous godlike angels. So when your first angel that you start with is Tyrael from Diablo, it's really hard to go up from there. So you have to up the ante with like something that's even more godlike and even more shiny and even more wings and more faces and more swords, you
Eyeballs.
know? Yeah, and eyeballs everywhere. And like, how do you up the ante from there? You increase the size. So now like one angel is like, 10 feet tall, the next one's 40 feet tall. Like it's just it's like a never ending scaling thing. So first of all, I think you really have to think about how are you going to expand the game and have a plan for how you do that. A lot of people kind of think that they have a plan because, oh, I'll just add more characters, but thematically, like the style of character that you add and has to be, it has to make sense. So I think having a plan for, if this game does well, this is kind of the direction that we would go. That's a really good idea. And the more detailed that is, the more fleshed out that is, the better. So one of the things, I think people make the mistake of rushing to Kickstarter. Deliverance took 5 years before we finally got there. And the reason was because I wanted the system to be solid so that I could expand it. I wanted players, with the type of game that it is, to be able to abuse the system, and that's actually not a bad thing. So that the system is so stable that by, there are very rare things that you can do to the system that breaks anything anymore. I think like on mission 4, Sardius players can pull the boss out of the cave, which the way it's worded, the boss won't do anything about it, which is kind of hilarious. And everyone finds that in mission 4 that plays Sardius and like, I did this cool thing. But that's actually kind of more of a fun thing for them. And the fact that it's not, in the regular skirmish, which is the replayable mode, there's no error in that. People just kind of are delighted more than anything. But yeah, so I think having a plan, and number one, for how you'll expand. Number two, making sure that your system is play tested enough, publicly play tested, without you being the human rule book. So one of the things I would always, people would always ask me, how does this work? I would always respond, how do you think it works? And that's the number, because it's hard for me. I like to talk. So as 196 episodes of this podcast can attest, um I'm very willing to give my opinion or whatever. And so in order, like when I'm doing blind playtesting or I'm playtesting with people in person, that's been my go-to. When they ask me, how does this work? I'll say, well, how do you think it works? And a lot of the time they have a plan and they have an intention of how they think it works, and that will maybe confirm, they're looking for me to confirm their suspicions. And so, but oftentimes it actually teaches me how they, how a player would interpret based on what I've written, which is always very useful. But yeah, so it's, I think that's another very important thing. Like figure out, make your system stable before you go to Kickstarter, because bottom line, like you're on a clock. As soon as you fund a Kickstarter, you're on a clock to deliver that product, which means that you have to wrap up the development of your game, whether or not it's done. It's only public, it's only printed, it's never done. And so that's why we took 5 years to get to Kickstarter, because I wanted the system to be solid. So, and then the other element of power creep that might be relevant for designers and people looking to make games is that it's not necessarily like within the same box. Like I mentioned, Legolas from Lord of the Rings, Journeys of Middle Earth. That is not bad that Legolas is stronger. Some players like to win, and they love playing characters that feel overpowered, that make it easier, and that will make them want to play again. But they're going to say, oh, I'm going to go with a different character like Gimli. Gimli's weak sauce, he's just like very kind of one dimensional. And, if you find yourself between a rock and a hard place with Gimli, then you might lose. Right. But whereas Legolas can run away and other things like that. But, so I think, to recognize that it's not necessarily a bad thing, that players love feeling powerful and they love winning, is something that I think is really important. That people want to know that they have the capacity to lose. Like if I made this decision differently, I would have lost, but I am smart, so I made the right decision and therefore I won. I think board games overall are just a tool to help players feel clever. you want your players to feel clever, and if they feel clever, then they're delighted, and if that means that their character was able to cleave down 3 goblins in a single attack, whereas Gimli would have taken 3 actions to do that, then that's totally cool. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that the failure to plan properly is the thing that causes the greatest amount of problems here, or maybe rushing the design so that there's a clear flaw in the design that makes people, unhappy. I want to say, I can't remember exactly what it was from Tainted Grail, but the first Tainted Grail campaign from Awakened Realms, there was this mechanic in the game that related to like obelisks and travel or something, but that they fixed in Kings of Ruin. And there are certain things that people will house rule to fix that should have probably been, you know, tested out of the base game. It's impossible to get everything perfect. So as a designer, you're doing the best that you can. But I think that it's really important to give it the time in the public eye before you actually publish it. Your prototypes. I want to say 2,000 games of Deliverance were played before I actually hit Kickstarter. And I don't, not all games are as big as that, but I think that that's solid advice, because at the end of the day, when you make your game, you release it, the market will rate your game and tell you how good it was. Like, I know everybody loves Deliverance. We have some of the highest number of tens of, ratio wise, of like any game on BGG. And it's because it delighted a certain group of people like so much. But I know, based on others that rate at, between 7, 8, or 9, the reason they're not rating at 1 point higher is because of story. It's like, I should have maybe taken a different approach with the story. And actually, that's one thing we're going to do when we remaster the second edition, is we're going to expand the story a little bit, because that's what players really wanted the angels to interact with humanity a little bit more, versus making it abstract. And the reason I made it abstract was because I didn't have enough room to write. The scenarios take a certain amount of space, and so I didn't want to add extra pages. I wanted to keep the book as small, as thin as possible. And it turns out that sometimes people want more story. So that's those are some of my reflections based on my experience.
Yeah, it's all learning curve, and I think another thing to keep in mind is it's your first product and it's the first edition. So it's like, with this reprint, you can go back and you can tweak some of those things. We can adjust certain settings to make them a bit more complementary or whatever. I think another thing is that different players will find different things in your game and appreciate or critique them based on those things. So I know Shelfside just did a review of Deliverance, and Daniel, who's sort of like one of these competitive Yu-Gi-Oh players, like this kind of, he min-maxes stuff. He's all about the meta. So he like really went to town with Deliverance, and he found some sort of things you can exploit in Deliverance. But I guarantee you that 99% of people aren't going to find those things. So if you sort of design your entire game based on those people, you might delight them, but you probably will make a game so complex or so difficult or so kind of technical that's going to push out the majority of players. So I think that's another thing to kind of keep in mind as well, is that when you're designing games with power creep in mind and mechanics, you sort of have to think, am I creating this mechanical, or am I doing this design to like get people in, like an easy entry point, or am I doing it for the alpha gamer who wants that kind of really challenging experience, is going to like min-max everything and only cares about like it has a spreadsheet of what the most like effective method of winning the game.
That was a really good point too, of just having the different difficulties of characters, so that it's like, yeah, as a grown man, I can do a lot of the expletive stuff, but I also want to be able to hand a simple angel to my kids so that we can play together.
Yeah, and that's why you don't play Twilight Imperium with 7-year-olds. It's like,
yes,
just
Arkham Horror, anybody?
Yeah. So it's I think that it's really important to have the target market in mind when you're making your game, and in general, the people who will be delighted most by your game, that's who you should lean into and make the game for those people. So I think my final kind of I'll open it up for final thoughts here real quick, but my final thought is know who you're making the game for. Someone who sees the game, like, for example, a Daniel, like an elite gamer from Shelfside, will look at something that he found that's super powerful and just say, well, if I do this every time, then I've beat the game. So I don't need to play the game because I've beaten it, just in my mind, while someone else will look at that and say, and those players are very, very few. But then someone else will look at that and say that's more like of a casual looking to get a game in every, once or twice a week, maybe. That's like twice a week is a lot for them. They'll look and say, oh, I found an amazing combination. I feel amazing. And then they had a really great experience and they're like, they can't wait to play again. And, the latter type of person far outweighs in quantity the former, which is like that elite gamer. So it does depend on, like, I would make chess, I would just be like angels on one side, demons on the other. And then it would appeal to like the elite gamer. So it just is, you definitely you want to decide who it is that you're making the game for and kind of prioritize their feedback, because you're going to get like, I before I released Deliverance, I got plenty of feedback that was like, this is too easy. I've found a way to like abuse the system. And a lot of the time people will say that and then still almost die. But they'll be like, I'm amazed. And then they'll have this realization 3/4 of the way through the game, like, I'm 2 health from death. So,
To be honest,
they
when I was
thought they
playing, I
were
was kind of
amazing.
trolling you. It's like, oh, so easy. Just beat the mission so easy.
Yeah.
Like, it just survived. Like, energy so easy. The game's so easy.
It's like everyone's at 1 HP, 2 people are dead, so easy. But yeah, so that's sometimes, you need to prioritize some feedback over others. One will say it's too easy, one will say it's too hard. And overall, I would prioritize the people that are, not as skilled, because the people who are not as skilled are going to be, 100 times more than the, just comparative to the most skilled players. You're going to have exponentially more of the kind of casual or new players that play your game one time. And if they have a bad experience that one time, they're never opening it again. So, it always makes me laugh when I see infinite replayability as like a big feature. Like, yeah, my game has infinite replayability too. But are people going to play it an infinite number of times? No, I mean, if I get a dozen games out of someone, then they had a ton of fun from the box. So, it's very, and, we've had players that have played, 100 games, 200 games, or more just in 6 months or whatever, a year of the game being out. And those players, it really delights. And oftentimes they're playing on like the lowest difficulty level, even still after 100 games, and just playing and just, it's delighting them, and they still lose, It's like,
And that's a good point, because not every game has to be a lifestyle game. There could be games that you just pick up, you play a handful of times. I enjoyed that, and you should put it on the shelf and maybe play it now and again, or you sell it or you pass it on. So I think that's important as well. I think there's a lot of pressure. Like, I'm going to create the next thing, and it's particularly there for video games. Especially like MMOs try to do that. The next lifestyle game, MMO, and they always sort of get knocked down. But yeah.
It's small. What is it? The space at the top is very small. So yeah, I think in general, if you can get people to play your game 2 to 3 times, then you've hit average. And if you can get people to play your game a dozen times, then you've hit like top 5% of games. So, and people will play a game once and say, I love it. This is my favorite of this genre, and talk about it like that, but haven't played it in a year. I love Lord of the Rings, the card game, but I haven't played it in like 2 years. I've still got all the expansions and stuff on my shelf, and it brings me joy every time I look at it. But I actually haven't taken it out of the box in a long time. Same thing with Chronicles of Crime. I played that game up like so hard. Or Journeys to Middle Earth. I played that like 150 games of Journeys to Middle Earth, but not in the last, probably 9 months. So, it's just one of those things that I love that game. But yeah, I've moved on to other things, and I will still talk positively about it and everything, but yeah. So I'll get the itch again and then go back. That's what I always say, right? So, any final thoughts, Nate?
No.
All right.
It's blank slate over here.
All right. Well, I'll say one other thing is that I know I in the beginning of this episode I teased that we did a Deliverance raid over the weekend at an event. We'll talk about that next week, because next week is the week before we actually launch Deliverance on Kickstarter, and it'll be a good episode to talk about. Yeah, my palms are sweaty even thinking about that. So we'll talk about what is kind of going through my head in our podcast next week, because eventually you guys are going to be in this exact same position. I've been here once before, and it'll be great. And then we'll also add in the discussion of what happened over the weekend at the convention. So, but for now, Nate, if somebody wants to have their game designed on Board Game Arena, how do they get in touch with you? I can say personally, you're an incredible designer and you know the system so well. I highly recommend you as a Board Game Arena designer. And how can people get in contact with you if they're interested in getting a quote or just learning more?
So you can find me on Discord, Kogo Garag, or you can email me at nate@kogogarage.com. And
you spell your name weird.
well,
right?
I spell it normal to me. You can see it in the corner down here.
Yeah, it's Kneight. That's epic. So we'll make sure
Yes.
all of that's in the show notes. But Kogo is Kogo, and garage, like garage door, right?
Yes.
KogoGarage.com.
Because I am Kogagorog online, and all my gaming, that's where people know me as just Kogo usually.
Okay.
And then I'm programming most frequently in my garage instead of in my office where I am right now.
Well, very good. So yeah, definitely if you're interested in Board Game Arena, hit them up and get a quote. Again, highly recommended, Kneight Reinagel. So, all right. Well, that is going to be it for this week's episode. So let's have Robot Richard send us on out.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week's episode of Crowdfunding Nerds. For more resources, articles, and to listen to past podcasts, please visit us at crowdfundingnerds.com. And if you have a crowdfunding question, we also have a page on our site where you can send a message directly to us. Please visit crowdfundingnerds.com/question. And if your question is a great question, we may include it in a future podcast. Thank you all again for listening to this week's episode, and we'll see you next week. Stay nerdy.